Hello, Banstead. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Dan James. I'm the assistant pastor at Avenue Community Church in Leicester, and I'm leading a team of people who are planting a church in a council estate in the south of the city called Ayers Monsell. If you want to know more about that, please get in touch. I'm sure people there have my details, or you can find me on Twitter. It's a real privilege to be able to bring God's word to you today. I'm looking forward to this. I wish I could be there in person, but maybe one day soon. And I hope it's going to be as much help to you as it has been to me as I've been preparing it. Now, I want to start by sharing a little bit about me. I'm a little bit of a music obsessive. So my wife calls it weird, miserable music, but I really like it, and I get quite prone to obsession with it. And I also fancy myself or used to anyway, as a bit of a singer-songwriter with the old guitar. And so I'd often find myself listening to music and thinking, I wish I'd written that song. Like, that song so perfectly and captures how I feel about a certain thing, whatever it might be. I wish I'd written it. Have you ever felt like that? Have you ever thought that? Maybe it's just me. If you have, I'd love to know what sort of songs come to your mind for you. And please let me know. Again, find me on Twitter, email, whatever. But whether your mind went to this type of music or not, I wonder if you've ever thought that way about like some of the hymns and the songs we sing together as churches. Which of those songs do you wish you'd written that either have captured how you feel about the Lord so perfectly, or have just helped you and encouraged you and given you so much help and joy over the years? Which of those songs do you wish that you'd written? There have been some belters written, haven't there, over the centuries? And I think it'd be really great to think that you've been so helpful and useful to so many people with something you've written. Well, the psalm we're going to look at today is somebody's one shot to write a song that is going to help God's people in their praise. That word psalm means song or song of praise. So the guy who wrote Psalm 88 we're going to be looking at, Heman, the Ezrahite, not that Heman, he gets one shot. This is his only psalm in the whole of the book. He was a priest, and so he was one of Israel, God's people's worship leaders. And so we read about him in 1 Chronicles 15 and 16. We know he's a guy who's leading Israel in singing God's praises. And this is the one psalm of praise that he leaves behind for all of God's people for the following 3,000 plus years. This song is his legacy. But it's a psalm that really leaves us with a question, I think. And the question's this: if the Psalms are songs of praise, where is the praise in this one? Where is the praise in Psalm 88? The truth is, we're going to read it in a moment, but if this was written by someone today, this wouldn't get sung in many of our churches, I don't think. In fact, this is a sort of psalm that sounds like the sorts of things that protest atheists could say. And by protest atheists, I mean those people who might look at the idea of a God but look at the world around and just think, oh, with all this pain and with all this misery and all the pain in their own hearts and all the suffering people go through, someone who looks at all that and concludes that if there is a God, he gave up a long time ago on us. And if he was around, I wouldn't want anything to do with him. I mean, just look at the world. Who'd want to be involved in a God that allows that anyway? You see, this isn't a psalm you're going to find posted on Instagram with a nice background. No, this is a bleak, miserable psalm of despair. So how on earth can a psalm like this be in the Bible? If the Psalms are songs of praise, what is this one doing here? Like, can despair be praise? I guess is the big question. Can misery be praise? Now, many of us are going to be theologically aware enough watching this to say that, yes, of course, despair can be praise. A lot of us will know that the book of Psalms is a great example of that. Nearly a third of the Psalms are exactly that, what the Bible calls lament. Sometimes they're an individual person's lament, like this psalm, and sometimes they're a whole corporate people's lament, put in the viewpoint of a whole nation, like Psalm 137. But the truth is, even Psalm 88 isn't like all the other lament psalms. Almost all of the other lament psalms end with a kind of positive-ish ending. So look at Psalm 13, a very famous psalm of lament. Quite bleak, but then it ends with the phrase, I will trust in your unfailing love. My heart rejoices in your salvation. I will sing the Lord's praise, for he's been good to me. Most of the lament psalms end with a renewed decision to trust God, despite all the hurt that the psalmist feels. So we're going to read Psalm 88 now. My wife's going to read it for us. And if you've got a Bible handy, I'd encourage you to read along and just try and spot any kind of praise or hope or positivity in Psalm 88.
Psalm 88, a song, a psalm of the sons of Korah, for the director of music, according to Malahath Leonoth, a maskil of Heman the Ezrahite. Lord, you are the God who saves me. Day and night I cry out to you. May my prayer come before you. Turn your ear to my cry. I'm overwhelmed with troubles, and my life draws near to death. I am counted among those who go down to the pit. I am like one without strength. I am set apart with the dead, like the slain who lie in the grave, whom you remember no more, who are cut off from your care. You have put me in the lowest pit, in the darkest depths. Your wrath lies heavily on me. You have overwhelmed me with all your waves. You have taken me from my closest friends and made me repulsive to them. I am confined and cannot escape. My eyes are dim with grief. I call to you, Lord. Every day I spread out my hands to you. Do you show your wonders to the dead? Do their spirits rise up and praise you? Is your love declared in the grave, your faithfulness in destruction? Are your wonders known in the place of darkness, or your righteous deeds in the land of oblivion? But I cry out to you for help, Lord. In the morning my prayer comes before you. Why, Lord, do you reject me and hide your face from me? From my youth I have suffered and been close to death. I have borne your terrors and am in despair. Your wrath has swept over me. Your terrors have destroyed me. All day long they surround me like a flood. They have completely engulfed me. You have taken from me friend and neighbour. Darkness is my closest friend.
Did you hear any of that positivity? No, none. In fact, if you were listening really closely, you'd have spotted that the word dark gets mentioned 3 times in this psalm. In fact, in the original Hebrew, the last word of the psalm is darkness. My closest friend is darkness, it ends. And that's the theme of this psalm, isn't it? And there's no hope in here anyway. None. Darkness is my closest friend. What a way to finish a song of praise. That line, darkness is my closest friend, it's the idea that at the end of the day, even with all the pain, at least the oblivion of sleep will wipe away my memory for a bit. I get some rest from this pain. My one comfort is oblivion. You won't find this kind of prayer in any other religion. Usually songs and prayers like this are found being sung by non-Christians, as we said earlier, but in the Bible? Like, can we really pray stuff like this to God? Can we really rage against God quite like this? And we might understand it in musicals and films and stuff that we see around about us, like in Les Miserables. Is that how you say it? The words Fontaine sings in I Dreamed a Dream. I dreamed a dream in times gone by when hope was high and life worth living. I dreamed that love would never die. I dreamed that God would be forgiving, but the tigers come at night with their voices soft as thunder, as they tear your hope apart, as they turn your dreams to shame. I had a dream. My life would be so different from this hell I'm living, so different now from what it seemed now life has killed the dream I dreamed. We understand that song, that sentiment fits in the film. But does it belong in the Bible? Like, can we really pray these kind of things? I mean, he starts off well, right? In verse 1, Lord, you are the God who saves me. So this guy is definitely what we'd call a Christian, but that's the most hopeful note in the whole song. And then the rest of the psalm is just sadness, followed by bleakness, ending in despair and darkness. So can despair be praise? Can despair be worship? Well, the God of the Bible says yes, definitely. Despair can be praise. Despair can be worship, because despair can be prayed. What do you do with your despair? In fact, I know what some of you do with your despair, because I know that some of you watching this are British. So what we do is we just bury our despair under layer and layer of politeness and manners, just have another cup of tea or coffee, stiffen our upper lips, and then just get on with life. Or at least until we're in traffic. And especially us men, I mean, we don't show despair, we don't show sadness like this. We tell everyone around us, no worries, I'm fine, I'm doing all right. And then we kill ourselves in unparalleled numbers. Men between the ages of 20 and 34 are killing themselves in ridiculous numbers in the UK. Suicide accounts for over a quarter of all deaths for men in that age bracket. So what do we do with our despair and our anguish? Because whatever it is we're doing at the moment, it's not helping. Thankfully, this psalm, I think, tells us what to do. And this psalmist tells us to pray it. He tells us, as honest as we can, to vocalize our feelings to God. And he shows us that it's more than okay to do that, because then despair becomes praise. See, if we just vocalize it to ourselves or tell it to others, that's just grumbling, isn't it? If we keep it all in and build it up inside of us, that's wallowing. But when we pour it out to God, maybe with the help of other people, well, that is praising him, because it's demonstrating the faith that we believe Jesus really means it when he says, whoever comes to me, I will never drive away. The challenge really is of a psalm like this. Do we really believe that? Because if we really believed it, I think it would change how we behave. Perhaps it would help us to look at exactly what He-Man says he's feeling. And I think he gives us 3 pictures to help us see what he's feeling. Firstly, he says he feels closer to death than alive. Listen to how he describes it in verses 3 to 6. I am overwhelmed with troubles and my life draws near to death. I am counted among those who go down to the pit. I'm like one without strength. I'm set apart with the dead, like the slain who lie in the grave, whom you remember no more, who are cut off from your care. You have put me in the lowest pit, in the darkest depths. Closer to being dead than alive. Have you ever felt like this? Like you're basically already dead? Have you ever longed to just feel anything but misery at all? Like you're numb, perhaps to the point of being empty? The 19th century preacher, you might know him, Charles Spurgeon, he understood this feeling well. He was a brilliant preacher known as the Prince of Preachers, but he experienced deep depression throughout his life. And on these verses, he said this: the psalmist felt as if he was as utterly forgotten as those whose carcasses are left to rot on the battlefield. As when a soldier, mortally wounded, bleeds unheeded amid the heaps of slain. How low the spirits of good and brave men will sometimes sink. Under the influence of certain disorders, everything will wear a somber aspect, and the heart will dive into the profoundest deeps of misery. Have you ever felt like that? Have you ever felt closer to being dead than being alive? He-Man the Ezrahite did. But then secondly, in verse 7 and then 15 to 17, he tells us that he feels like he's drowning in sadness. Verse 7, your wrath lies heavily on me. You've overwhelmed me with all of your waves. And then verse 15, from my youth I've suffered and been close to death. I have borne your terrors and am in despair. Your wrath has swept over me. Your terrors have destroyed me. All day long they surround me like a flood. They have completely engulfed me. You just can't take any more of this pain and this sorrow and this anguish. Maybe you too know what this feels like. Like life's coming up to your neck and your chin, and you're on your tiptoes just trying to keep breathing. In fact, in this psalm, he's deeper than that. The water's taller than him and the waves still keep coming. Have you ever felt like you're drowning in sadness and sorrow? Again, if so, the Bible understands that. It's here in black and white. We can try and deny and hide these sorts of feelings and emotions, but the inspired word of God puts it out there in black and white for us to see. It's okay to not feel okay. It's more than fine to not be fine, depending on what you do with it. Now, you may be watching this and thinking, I get that people can feel like this. I understand that, Dan, but I've got no reason to feel that way. Nothing terrible's ever happened to me. I've got no right to feel as bad as I do. Or perhaps even worse, we might know people who are expressing this sort of feeling who we might think, why are they so miserable? They haven't been through anything like what I've been through, and I just get on with it. Well, again, I think Spurgeon here really helps us. He says, the mind can descend far lower than the body, for in it there are bottomless pits. He goes on to say that for our bodies, they can only take a certain amount of injury and illness. So if you're bleeding, There's only a certain amount of blood you can lose before you stop bleeding because you die. And that'll be over. But for the mind, there are bottomless pits. He says, the soul can bleed in 10,000 ways and die over and over again each hour. For the mind, there are bottomless pits. So if you're feeling this way and you feel like things that you have no reason to feel, please can you stop adding to your pain to stop feeling like you shouldn't feel so bad? Again, the Bible doesn't do that. Instead, it gives words to your pain. God doesn't call you to work out how right you are to feel what you feel before you come to him. No, he just tells you to come to him. But we need to be clear that while this kind of prayer is part of the Christian life, it also shouldn't be the entirety of the Christian life. 1 in 3 Psalms are lament, not 3 out of 3. So while it's true that if we never talk to God like this, something might not be quite right in our Christian walk, it's also true that if we only talk to God like this, then something might not be quite right in our lives. So if our only experience of life and the Christian life is this kind of pain and anguish, that very well might be something we need to get some extra help in. Can I encourage you not to be too afraid to go to a doctor or to seek help if you're feeling like this a lot? But even when we are feeling like this, even if it is all the time, we can still pour it out to our Father in heaven in whatever manner we choose. When we look at verse 15, he says, from my youth I've suffered and been close to death. I mean, this is almost certainly an exaggeration, especially from what we know about him from other parts of the Bible. But that doesn't matter, because in this moment, this is how he feels. And he knows God cares about how he feels, even if it might be a bit over the top. So he can and he does bring this feeling and this anguish, this over the top exaggeration to God. And he doesn't caveat it, he doesn't justify it, he doesn't try and explain it. He just feels like he's drowning, so he calls out to God. But the third thing he tells us that he feels in verses 8 and 18 is that he feels completely abandoned. Verse 8, you've taken from me my closest friends and have made me repulsive to them. I'm confined and cannot escape. And then verse 18, you've taken from me friend and neighbour. Darkness is my closest friend. He feels closer to being dead than alive, and he feels like he's drowning in sadness. And now, thirdly, he feels completely abandoned, friendless. The only friend he has is darkness. Those people that were his friends, well, he now feels like they hate him, like they're repulsed by him. But worse than that, verse 14, he feels like God has rejected him too. He's crying out to God, verse 9 and 13, but nothing's coming back. Heaven is silent. In fact, he feels like God's turned his back on him. He feels completely abandoned, even by God. Have you ever felt something like this? I imagine some of us watching today have. We are meant to resonate with these feelings. That's why they're in the Bible. But the question still remains, what do we do with these feelings? Are we meant to just bury them deep down, maybe write them down for our own journals, but then put on our church face or our Zoom face and just smile because that's going to make everybody else feel better? Is that what we're meant to do? When every third psalm expresses this kind of pain, what are we meant to do with it? Well, He-Man prays his despair. He's still faithful in the midst of suffering, even if it doesn't look like the way we think faithfulness looks. Look at some of the things he says to God. The truth is, I think a lot of us will be appalled if we heard this sort of things at our prayer meetings. He's almost sarcastic in verses 10 to 12, isn't he? Or do you show your wonders to the dead? Do their spirits rise up and praise you? Is your love declared in the grave, your faithfulness in destruction? Are your wonders known in the place of darkness, or your righteous deeds in the land of oblivion? I think here he's basically saying to God, I feel like you've got this wrong. You say you want to display to the world around you how amazing and magnificent you are. Well, I think you're doing that pretty badly at the moment, God. And if I'm dead, if I'm in the grave destroyed in the place of darkness or oblivion, I can't praise you. And in truth, I feel like I'm almost there. What are you doing, God? Amen. Have you ever felt like that? More importantly, have you ever prayed like that? Have you ever dared vocalize something like this to God? Are our church families and spaces places where we can feel safe saying this to each other without fear of being thrown out or judged or whatever it may be? If we learn nothing else from Psalm 88, we need to learn that it is okay to admit when we feel like this, that it is wrong to bottle it up, and it is right to speak it out. But we must speak it out first and foremost to God. I mean, that's who He-Man is clearly addressing here, isn't it? He's clearly crying out to God, not the people around him. He's not just grumbling. He's not after pity and sympathy. No, he's crying out in the faith that God can take it. This is a man close to giving up on what he believes, and instead of keeping that in or telling it to other people only, he takes it to God. He's riddled with doubts and hurts, but he knows the glorious truth that if we've got a complaint, we need to take it to the manager. The theologian and author J.I. Packer passed away last year, and his book Knowing God has been influential on Christians for decades now, and he says this in it: God uses chronic pain and weakness along with other afflictions as his chisel for sculpting our lives. Felt weakness deepens dependence on Christ for strength each day. The weaker we feel, the harder we lean. And the harder we lean, the stronger we grow spiritually, even while our bodies waste away. That's so true. But it still hurts. The knowledge of that truth doesn't remove the hurt of the moment. And Psalm 88 tells us, if nothing else, that when we feel this pain, tell God. Lean on him. He knows how we feel already, and he can handle hearing far more of our anguish and pain than I think we think he can. So he felt closer to death than life. He felt like he was drowning in sadness, and he felt completely abandoned. And part of the challenge and encouragement I want to leave us with today is that this sort of prayer is right and good, and it's healthy to pray this. When we hurt like this, we must pray like this. When we doubt like this, we must pray like this. Putting on a brave face or a holy church way of speaking might make us feel protected and safe, but it hides the truth and stops us getting help. But I think there are three other quick things I want us to take away from Psalm 88 going forward. So firstly, we've already said it, but if you feel like this, if you're hurting, if you're in anguish, if you feel so full of doubts like you're about to give up on God and Christianity altogether, pray that. Tell God. Do not keep it in. God can handle your complaints. He's not like an easily offended parent sitting there waiting to say, "How dare you?" He wants to hear what's on your heart. And when you feel this and don't tell him, he knows it already. So why hide it from him? And when it's just you and God, don't feel like you have to coat your complaints in politeness. Heman the Ezrahite doesn't, and it's in the Bible for us all to see plainly and clearly. Pour out your heart to God, and instead of grumbling and complaining or despair alone, it becomes praise and worship to a God who knows you and loves you and who cares for you. The Bible means it when it tells us to cast all our anxiety on him because he cares for us, 1 Peter 5. We're allowed to lament, so do it. Take it all to God. But secondly, if you know someone who's feeling this, can I encourage you to let them? Let them feel this way. Help them give voice to that feeling. We might not think their reaction or emotion is proportional to their circumstances, but we need to remember that for the mind, there are bottomless pits. Maybe we need to get better at listening to each other hurt and mourn and despair and lament. Our job is to listen and to help the other person turn it into worship and praise by taking them to God in prayer. Listen to their complaints and feel their hurt with them if you can. I think that's part of our role as the body of Christ together as a local church. Bearing one another's burdens, weeping when each other weep. I really struggled with depression throughout my teenage years and early 20s. At points it got pretty bleak. And I remember one time I just felt completely unable to pray, to say anything to God. I felt so sad, so close to killing myself, so full of this kind of anguish. And I was lucky to have a good friend to chat to at the time. I was just telling them, I just can't pray. And they said, well, then let me do it. And on the phone, they just took my feelings to the Lord in prayer, prayed as if they were in my place, spoke to God with me and for me. And I think that's one of the most powerful things that happened to me during my mental health struggles. Can I encourage you to try doing that, listening to people, seeing how they're feeling, and taking them to God in prayer when they can't go themselves? I think one of the things Christians need to be careful of when people come to us with this kind of feeling is using that phrase, at least. The truth is, at least ruins empathy. I mean, someone could have said to He-Man, well, at least you've got a good job, or something similar. But at least never helps. At least you have a husband. At least you can get pregnant. At least you have a job. At least anything. It doesn't help. It isn't what He-Man needed, and it isn't what we need from each other. We need to be able to be better at listening to each other and encouraging each other to take all of our complaints to God. So we need to be able to pray this kind of prayer, and we need to be able to listen to each other feel this more often. But finally, and most importantly, we need to see Jesus in this. And it can be very easy to look at a psalm like Psalm 88 and think, where is Jesus in this? But he was known as a man of sorrow and familiar with grief. Seeing the pain and the hurt of the world around that he loved crushed him. And we can't forget that Jesus would have sung this psalm in the temple as part of his worship of God. And wonderfully, Jesus demonstrates that God isn't a God who sits in heaven looking at us with our hurt and despair saying, well, at least no. Our God is a God who says, I know your pain. I know what it's like. When we're in the pit of despair, God doesn't just stand at the top and say, I'm really sorry you're hurting so much. No, he jumps into the pit with us and says, I know how you feel. Jesus knew what it was like to feel closer to death than life. As he hung on the cross between earth and heaven, closer to death than life, he knows how we feel. And he knew what it felt to feel like he was drowning in grief. Now, the night before he died, you may have read this a few weeks ago at Easter, he prayed in Gethsemane. He says to his disciples, my soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. I mean, if that doesn't sound like Psalm 88, then I don't know what does. And then more than just feeling abandoned, Jesus was abandoned. When he needed everyone most, all of his friends who claimed they'd die for him ran away. His fiercest defender is so scared to be associated with him that the questioning of a little girl causes him to swear he never even met Jesus. And on the cross, Jesus cries out with more truth than He-Man or we will ever have to cry out, my God, why have you forsaken me? Jesus was completely abandoned by his friends and his God for us. So he did all of that so that we can be certain that when we feel like we're abandoned by God, we can trust and know that we never will be. He was abandoned. He was crushed. He was drowned in sorrow so that we will never fully sink beneath the surface. So if you're feeling this psalm keenly today or any day in the future, stock this up for then, please tell someone. And tell someone who'll help bring it to God with you. And he'll bring you to God. He'll help you bring it to the only God who knows what it's like to feel this pain and this anguish and this despair, but who did everything necessary to make sure this pain isn't the end. And if someone comes to you and tells you this, pray with them. Take them to this psalm even and pray it with them to God. You see, Psalm 88 shows us that despair, pain and anguish and grief can all be worship if we take it to God. So cast all of your burdens on the Lord because he cares for you.